Just a couple of quick announcements. As I mentioned, the end of this month, the last Sunday of the month, will be communion service in the morning service. We're going to come believing God to give us a wonderful time together. I tell you this ahead of time. First of all, I want you to prepare your hearts. I want you to come. There's nothing more sacrilegious than to partake of these vital elements and not think on the weight of them and the blessing of them. And I've prayed many times, Lord, help me to never become so familiar with these things that we fail to appreciate their significance and wealth and blessing. I think I've told about Rob, a young man that used to attend our church years ago. And Rob told how that he never really knew what communion was, nor what it meant, nor anything about it. He grew up Catholic, and he said it was just one of those things we did. But he said, I came here and began to hear why we do it, the meaning and the way, and it became sacred. You know, it can become secular. It's just a ritual. But thank God for this wonderful time. Let's be mindful of that. Last week I began with a series that we're going to be tracking now through some weeks until I'm able to finish. My struggle is that when you begin into these historical realms, it's hard to know what to put in and what to leave out. They're just too much. I mean, we have 2,000 years now to talk about in a few weeks. And so I'm going to try with my aim and purpose. Why do we study history? Do you realize the Bible is a book of history? And as you study the Bible, you're seeing how God did things. You're seeing the people that He did them through. You're seeing the work that was done. But suddenly you come to the book of Acts and you read that, and all of a sudden there's this gigantic, enormous cliff. Everything ends. I've tried to imagine. I've tried to place myself into that dungeon when Paul wrote his letter to Timothy, his son. When he said, the time of my departure is at hand. I'm ready to be offered. The time of my departure is at hand. I fought a good fight. I finished my course. Some years ago, I don't know if some of you were here, I preached a series on the life of Paul, and that last message, when we stepped behind that curtain and thought about what it must have been like as Paul the Apostle laid that pen down and looked out the window, not knowing just when that guard would come and lead him away. His life would be taken from him. Did you know that the history of the church is a history of persecution? You and I have lived in relative comfort and blessing. And when we look back on history, every generation has faced its persecution. In fact, even tonight, while you and I are in safety and comfort, at least to the best of our ability, all around the world tonight, Christians are meeting in fear. When I go to India, Brother Sam asks me, he says, Brother Woodard, please don't put any pictures of the churches where they can be tracked. Because he said, in India, they are looking for Christian churches and they come and destroy them. In India, where there is a temple, a Hindu temple, and probably the closest thing to paganism of the Roman and Greco era would be India in a lot of respects, where they're building a road. If there is a temple, a Hindu temple, you will observe that the road can be straight as an arrow, but when it comes to that temple, it deliberately goes around it and continues. But if in that community there is a Christian church, they will deliberately put the road right through where that church is and destroy it and tear it down with no remuneration, no allowance made for their loss. They will do it with glee and gladness. It's the price of being a Christian. The church was cradled in Jerusalem. Our Lord was crucified. Those disciples went to that upper room, and immediately upon their exit and preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, the early Christians were confronted with persecution. Stephen was the first Christian martyr. He gave his life looking up into the heavens, saying, "I see the Son of God standing at the right hand of the throne of power." And then James, his life was taken. And as the Christian church began to spread, Jerusalem became a hotbed because of the Jewish people who hated Christ. Naturally now, those who came along and professed faith in Christ, those who believed in this sacrilegious man who claimed to be the Son of God, the Son of their God, of Jehovah, they hated him and they reached out, and so they incited the Roman government in order that they would destroy these Christians, and Herod was more than happy to comply. As Jerusalem persecution broke out, and as the Christians began to be hauled off before the magistrates and before the councils, the church began to move out of Jerusalem and into other areas, and a key location became a place called Antioch in Syria. Antioch was named after Antioch Epiphanes. And it was there that a great revival broke out in Acts chapter 11. And following the persecution in Jerusalem, the Christian center kind of moved over to Antioch. And such a great revival, it was the first multiracial church. There were people of all stripes that began to believe, the Greeks, and you follow along. Evidently, there was an explosion in Antioch. And Barnabas, the son of consolation, I love to preach about Barnabas. The word consolation means encouragement. He was an encourager. And Barnabas knew that they needed a pastor, and just a month or so before that, a man by the name of Saul had met his match on the road to Damascus. And it was there that Saul was struck. I like to say he was knocked off his high horse. A great light surrounded him. Saul goes on into the city, and there Ananias comes and lays his hands on him, says, "Brother Saul, I am come that thou mightest receive thy sight and be filled with the Holy Ghost." And he was sanctified. Paul the apostle, Saul, who at that point was still named Saul, Barnabas went and brought him. And Saul, who later became Paul, was the first pastor of the church at Antioch. You'll remember that a chapter or two later, Paul the apostle and Barnabas working together, there were prophets who rose up and they began to work, and evangelism was strong. The words jump off the page, and the word of the Lord grew mightily. And Paul then, you remember that the Spirit spoke and said, "Separate unto me Paul and Barnabas." And so Paul heads out on his missionary journeys, and Christianity then begins to spread beyond just these localized areas. It moves up into Ephesus, where Diana is dethroned, and there Christianity takes root and moves on and across and into Rome, the center, the world capital. And so Rome seems to kind of become a central point, but really Christianity then keeps its headquarters kind of by default over at Antioch and then up in Ephesus. And I preached to you last week that the disciples, where they all went, some down into India, some down into Alexandria, and others across over into Rome. And so the Christian fire begins to spread, and little churches begin to explode out across these various little areas wherever the disciples went preaching. And so the apostolic age is described as that era of the apostles when they go out into evangelism, and ultimately the last living apostle was the apostle John. John stays in Ephesus and kind of becomes the de facto head of the New Testament church. John has some disciples that follow him that we will talk about later. But this is the apostolic age. And after John dies, then you begin to see the rise of what is called the early church fathers. Out across that era, you begin to see persecution. And there's something that we need to understand about the persecution of the early church. I think in my early thinking on this, I had understood that persecution was something that happened every night, and that the streets were lined with crucifixions and burning bodies, and every day Christians were thrown to the lions. But folks, there's something important to understand. While it is true that Christians were persecuted, it was not constant. That period from AD 70 that I've already mentioned was the end of the Jewish nation, so to speak, up until the year 313, which is a pivotal point in Christian history. That is when Constantine supposedly became the first Christian emperor of Rome. He issued the Edict of Milan, which was the Edict of Tolerance. And so Constantine legalized Christianity, and next week we're going to dig a little more into that. But in this interval, there were 10 Roman emperors that brought persecution against the Christians. Now, we could talk about this and we'll touch on it, but folks, there's something more important to understand, and that is the question, why were the Christians persecuted? Why were they hated? In fact, if you study Roman history, you will discover that the Christians, like Christ, went about doing good. Even those of the empire said, we don't understand these people. We don't understand why they do what they do. And they were good people. In fact, as we will see in a little bit, they helped the helpless. They were marked by their love for one another. So therefore, why were they persecuted? There's this period up until about 313 that is called the Apostolic Age, the early church fathers. Sometimes it is often called the ante-Nicene period, and that is relating to the Council of Nicaea. We'll touch on that later. But you know what this period is often called? The age of Catholic Christianity. How many of you just got visions of priests and images of Mother Mary and holy water and little baptismal fonts pop into your mind? No, none of that. Push that away. That's years later. Do you know what the word Catholic means? Universal. There was no denominations. There wasn't even a geographical split. Christians were just Christians. The Bible said they were called Christians first at Antioch, followers of Jesus Christ. And so as this sect, this group rose up, there was a struggle in the beginning, and it came from their connection with the Jewish people. You will find when we study the Didache simply means the teachings. The Didache instructs Christians not to pray with the Jews. Why? The writer of the Didache, which was the early church manual, if you please. I know people hate those things, but that's kind of what it was. It was instructions to the early church and how that they were to live. And the Didache instructed them not to pray with Jews because the Jewish people were praying for the Messiah. The Christian knew their Messiah had come. And the reasoning was that at some point our prayers would be hindered. You also had the Roman government. The Roman government viewed these Christians as part of the Jewish sect. And so to them, this was just kind of an offshoot of it. But there's something interesting. The Jews were hated by the Roman government because of their militarism, and yet they respected the Jewish religion. And it was that way for one simple reason: its age. It was viewed as ancient. But Christians come along and they're a new sect. They're new believer. This new religion. And so the Roman people looked on it as foolishness and following this heretic, this Jesus or Christus. And so this was part of the reason that they were hated. And another reason that they were hated is because of naturally Christ that the Christians followed was the man that the Roman government hung on the cross. Therefore, all of these followers clamoring after this Christ, why, that was an affront to the Roman government. That was like pointing the finger of guilt. They preached that salvation was through this Christ. They preached that He's going to come back to this earth and set up His throne. Therefore, it was an affront to the Roman government who had crucified Christ. They were hated for that reason. Not only that, the Christians were viewed as weak. They wouldn't fight. They would not join the Roman legions because the Roman armies existed for the purpose of colonialism. Their whole purpose was to expand the reach of the Roman government and to bring in money. Therefore, Christians would not fight. But not only would they not join the armies and fight, they would not even fight for their own lives. They were pacifists, so to speak. Now, this is to be understood in the light of this reality. It doesn't mean that they did not defend their personal life. It did not mean that if somebody came in to harm them, that they would not. But when it came to Christianity and their accusation for being a Christian, they would not take up arms and fight back. Therefore, the Romans looked on them as weak. They looked on them as unworthy of even, let's get rid of these people. They're in our way. They're weak. They're viewed as having no real stand. And yet, on the other hand, they were also impressed with how willingly they went to the cross and how willingly they went to the lions. In fact, when they would take them to the lions, they did not often have to throw them to the lions. The Christians would walk out there willingly and praise God and sing while they were being killed for their faith. This was a conundrum to the Roman people. Another reason that they were persecuted and killed is that they lived separated lives. Radically separated lives. Christians would not partake of the festivals. They would have nothing to do with the festivals. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when I go to India, one of the things they often buttonhole me about, one of them is Halloween. Why do the Christians participate in Halloween? That's a big question. They also question me on why the Christians participate in Valentine's Day. They can go through these festivals. And the Christians of the early church would not at all participate in them. I told you about the night in India when Brother Sam was bringing us back, and we got caught up in that festival. And friends, we were marked men simply for the fact that our skin was light. And Brother Dan told me, said, Brother Woodard, we were in danger tonight. And I'm telling you what, it is a vile, wicked, folks. It's toned down here, but you go to third world countries, it is vile what they do on Halloween and what they do on these festivals. And the Christians just simply would not participate in any of the festivals. Also, the Christians would not involve themselves in the guilds. What was that? In essence, if you wanted to work in a certain area or in a certain, can I give you one? If you wanted to be a mason, you had to join the Masonry Guild or the Masons. And the purpose of them were very simply, they were for the promotion of the Masons, but they were more than that. They would get together and they would promote the gods, and they used their guild to do so, and part of it was a worship. It was weaved into every part of their life. And so the Christians would not involve themselves. They would choose to be poor rather than to be involved in the guilds. Are you ready for this? Christians would not even go to the hospitals. Here's the reason why. In the Roman world, hospitals were dedicated to a god called Asclepius. Not only that, in the hospitals, the priests would walk the hallways doing pagan chants and calling upon the spirits to come and to heal the bodies in the hospitals. Therefore, the Christians refused involvement in any of the hospitals. Now, I want to say it's interesting to me that in the past numbers of years, several hundred years, it is the Christians that have been primarily responsible for establishing hospitals. When I go to India, they tell me that if you want to go to a good hospital, go to the ones established by the Christians. And so here, missionary endeavors in America and across the world many times have been pushed and furthered by hospitals. Any of you remember Sister Debbie Common, and her work over in Africa is primarily promoted by the work of medicine. She's making possible for people to be healed and to be touched and to be cured of various ailments and diseases, but she doesn't follow their pagan ways and their pagan rituals. It's very different when you go into third world countries. We're talking about what was common among the Romans. And so here were these Christians, these followers of Christ, and they wouldn't go to the hospitals. They wouldn't be a part of what they were doing. Not only that, their separated lives, they were kind and loving. They were hated because of their kindness. You know, the New Testament says, behold how they love one another. Did you know, folks, that's the greatest witness the church has? Our love for one another. Listen to one man named Julian the Apostate. Atheism, by the way, that's what they called early Christians, were atheists. The reason is because they only served one God. The Romans had the pantheon. The Christians believed only in Christ. And so Julian the apostate said, atheism has been specifically advanced through the loving treatment rendered to strangers and through their burial of the dead. It is a scandal that there is not a single Jew who is a beggar, and that the godless Galileans care not only for their own poor, but for ours as well. Isn't that good? That's a man who hated the Christians. They fed the poor. They cared for the unfortunate. And even among that, they had love. One writer said, they loved each other before they even know each other. Isn't that good? Well, they were hated because they were a rebuke to the Roman ways of life. I mentioned it this morning in the morning service, but I want to mention it again. Rome never practiced abortion. They practiced infanticide. Girls were of very little value to the homes of that day. And so if they did not want them, they would simply put them out by the road like garbage. People would come by like garbage collectors and collect them. And many times they would go to the temples and they would become prostitutes. They would become abused for the sake of the priests and the low people. Isn't that disgusting? And the Christians cried out against it. The Christians gave dignity and equality to all men. Did you know you study early writers of that period, and they said, who does a man speak to less than his wife? Their wives were just property. Do you realize that I am so sick of the liberal media making it look like Christians discriminate? Do you want to know that no belief has given more dignity to women than Christianity? It was Christianity who honored the women who gathered around the cross. It was the Christians who believed that womanhood was honored because Mary gave birth to Christ. And I love what, oh, come on, help me out. Who's the guy from India that's a speaker? He's well known. Dr. Ravi Zacharias. Dr. Ravi Zacharias was asked about Christians and about women being demeaned. He said, oh, and that their view is that women are weak. He said, wrong. He said, why is it that the first person that was appeared to was a woman? Isn't that beautiful? Said, you want to talk about giving dignity to womanhood. And then he said, as to your charge of the women being weak, he said, I'd like to see men have babies. And he said, I'd like to see the men stand up. And then he told the story of his own mother. When his brother was dying, his father couldn't take it and had to leave. But he said, my mother sat there by that bed night after night with no sleep, while my father nearly broke getting rest and food. My mother was the strong one. And he said, no one gives more dignity to womanhood than does the Christian faith. I say thank the Lord. I want you ladies to know I appreciate you. And you actually have more power than you will ever know. God has granted you that. Not only that, they honored their wives. A Roman woman was not considered of any worth. They opposed infanticide, and not only that, the Christians were hated because they gave slaves equality. Paul even admonished them to treat their slaves with respect. It was Paul who wrote to Philemon telling him to accept Onesimus as a brother in the Lord. And the Bible, you read the writings of Paul, he said, we judge no man according to the flesh. It was James who said that we are not to promote a man based on his wealth. It was Christianity that broke up the cabal and the sense. And friends, it's been when Christianity has waned and backslid that it has gone back to those things. But I want to tell you something. Genuine Christianity gives respect and dignity to all men. And you know what? By the way, let me tell you something. It was the holiness people who fought to end slavery in America. The Methodists rose up against it. The Wesleyan Methodist Church was based on that very principle. It is they who cried out and became the conscience crying out against slavery, that one would own another man. And it was they who forced the issue. Now, I have an opinion, but it's only an opinion. It's my opinion. This is my thinking. The Great Awakening happened a few years later. Folks, I believe that had there been allowed the great revival that God wanted to give America, the bloodshed would not have been necessary. And you know, since I'm in trouble, I just as well finish. People have struggled with the division, and that some in the South rose up and that there was war. But I just want to say this, and I know you say, well, you're a Southerner. I was raised in the South, but I was raised to view something very important. Not everybody that fought was fighting for slavery. Some saw some other sides of it, and imperialism that was dangerous, and there's a long discussion there. Now I want to say this. Slavery is inexcusable, and thank God it ended, and it should have. Thank God. And that was an unfortunate bloodshed that took place. Oh, if only America would have turned sooner to God, and there would have been that great awakening that happened a few years later. That did more to heal our country than anything, the Great Awakening. Well, Christians were hated. And then, not only that, Christians were slandered. Of course, it was believed, and the story has been often told, that Nero, in about 66, wanted to rebuild Rome. And so it's believed that Nero blamed the Christians. This is a common theory, been written by several writers, that when he burned, and there's no evidence that Nero fiddled while Rome burned, but there is evidence, or it seems to be, that he was willing to let it happen, and then he blamed it on the Christians. That was the scapegoat. That was a convenient way to take the blame. And so they were scandalized. They were slandered. In fact, it was believed that Christians practiced cannibalism because they partook of the Lord's Supper, which was believed to be partaking of the Lord's body and the Lord's blood. They did not understand that. And so they believed that Christians practiced cannibalism. And then it was believed that they were atheists. They did not worship the pantheon or the gods. And so therefore everything in their life centered around a god. If there was no crops, it was because the gods were angry. If there was no rain, it was because the gods were angry. If there was no sun, then the sun god was angry. Therefore, it was believed that all these sacrifices had to be offered to these gods, and the Christians would not participate in it. Therefore, it was written that any time Tertullian said, if the river floods, or if there's an earthquake or famine breaks out, Tertullian said the cry is, Christians to the lions, because they would not participate in heathen worship. And finally, they would not offer incense to Caesar. So the god of Rome, the goddess, was Roma, and it was believed that the embodiment of that was in Caesar. And so every good Roman citizen was required to sacrifice a pinch of incense to Roma. And then they were to proclaim, Kyrios Kaiser, which means Caesar is Lord. The Christians wouldn't do it. They would not accept Caesar as Lord. Ladies and gentlemen, the Christians weren't killed because they followed Christ. They were killed because they would only follow Christ. Hear the Lord, O Israel. The Lord thy God is one Lord. You follow history, there has always been multiple gods worshipped, and yet Christianity comes along and promotes one God. The Lord is one God, and then they were taken off and murdered. Some were thrust through with swords. Some were burned at the stake. Yet some were taken to the lions, and some were sentenced to be taken to the mines, to be forced to work. There were a number of periods of this. The early Christians, there were times of toleration, and then there were times of persecution. Eusebius was a bishop. Let me just pause a moment. Bishop in our world, generally we think of leader. But folks, in the Bible days, a bishop was a pastor. He was a pastor over a church, and so he was considered the bishop. In the early church, there was no real sense of denominationalism. They were just Christians, and they would come together and discuss their differences and settle on them. And so, Eusebius lived during the time when Constantine came to power. He observed the Edict of Milan and lived during the great period of Christian persecution. And Eusebius, it is believed, was the first author of the book recounting the persecutions of the Christians. Are you aware tonight you can still get that book? You can get a digital version of it for free and read it and read about the persecutions. And it was that book written by Eusebius that Fox's Book of Martyrs was based off of. It's taken and translated and perhaps condensed some. But Eusebius lived during that period when Constantine came to power. He wrote his book some 10 to 20 years after the persecution ended. By the way, Eusebius was so thrilled and believed that Constantine was a genuine Christian. And it was that era that ushered in some of the great changes in the churches. It was just prior to that when the Christians, it is called the Great Persecution. And I don't have time to take you through the entirety of it, but the final great persecution came in about the year 303. There was 10 years, as it became known. There had been about 43 years of peace. It is during this period when Diocletian seized power, the emperor of Rome, by a coup, and survived to become a great reformer. However, pressed by his generals, he had made Maximian as co-emperor. He was also called Augustus in the West. And on March 1st, 293, they appointed two other military men, Constantius and Galerius, as their assistants or Caesars. The emperor's ideals were to return Rome to its former glory. Rome nearly fell. And so what happened was, part of their power or part of their design to return Rome to its greatness was to turn against the Christians and to purge the empire of the Christians. And so churches were destroyed, Christian services were banned, the scriptures were seized and burned, Christians in high places lost civil rights, and those private citizens were deprived of their liberty. One concession Diocletian made was no bloodshed. However, a second edict imposed an obligation on all clergy to sacrifice. The prisons became full. And in the autumn of 303, this was modified, and most of those in prison for refusing were released. However, under Valerian had been probably the bloodiest of times. And yet, during this last 10 years prior to Constantine, you had persecution that attacked the Christians and went after them daily, handing them over. And in 304, Diocletian was ill in Rome, and Galerius seized power and furthered the persecution, sending the Christians to the lions, murdering and killing them because they would not entertain the Roman gods. And in the spring of 312, Constantine entered. And I'll tell you more of the story of Constantine. But ultimately, the night before his victory, Constantine dreamed, he said that he dreamed of a cross. And the voice spoke to him and said, "In this sign conquer." Constantine seized power of the Roman government and became the emperor of Rome. And as one would say, the rest is history. A year later, issued the Edict of Milan and gave tolerance to the Christians. But actually, he went a lot further than that. And we're going to see that next week. I didn't have time tonight. I would like to have gone through some of the various Christians and their names. You've heard of men, storied men, like Polycarp, Origen. Polycarp was in Smyrna. His life was taken for his faith. It's believed that Polycarp was a disciple of John. There were many others who served during that era, and their lives, all of them were taken and given to the lions or taken for the sake of the gospel of Christ. Friends, you and I say again tonight, owe a great debt of gratitude to those precious saints who gave their life that you and I could have the gospel. By the 4th century after Christ had died, Christianity spread from the east to the west. This is interesting to me. If you follow the track of Christianity like the sun, it has always moved from east to west. By the 4th century, Christianity spread all the way to Britain, to Ireland. You ever heard of Patrick? Out into Gaul, which is current-day France. If you continue to follow the history of Christianity, it jumps the ocean. It comes across to America. It continues to move around to the east, to the Koreas, to Asia. And by the way, it will one day end up again in Jerusalem in a mighty victory and in a great revival. Thank God for our heritage of Christianity. We'll cover more next week, Lord willing. Shall we stand?